Hello, everybody. Day 2 of this really interesting, weird, abstract unit that's all over the place. I'm really interested in a lot of what you guys have said and what you guys have to say. Um, I've seen video responses from Maria, Rosa, and Shannon since I last posted. And yeah, I think we all can kind of agree that this reading was a little abstract, was a little neither here nor there, as it says about itself. Maria, you responded directly to how I experienced what went on with Black Lives Matter and Stephen Clark in Sacramento. And I agree with you in that, experiencing things like that in person is important. It helps you have a stronger connection to the issues, like you said, and it makes you want to be more involved. And it's so much more striking seeing in person. I think that we touched upon that sort of a little bit differently towards the beginning of classes when we, lost the ability to speak. When we were discussing seeing artworks in person as opposed to seeing them online, seeing them in person is just so much different. It's so much more awe-inspiring, and you can see all the textures and details, and you can learn so much more about the history just by looking at the actual piece itself. And that feeling sort of translates into seeing things like protests in person. It's just so much more striking, and it makes you want to be involved, and it really it hammers in that message a bit more delicately. Well, not delicately, that's not the right word, a bit more directly than it would over like a social media post or something. Let's see what else. Technology brings exposure and information is something else that you touched upon, Maria. Like Rosa, you also talked about this too in your video response about how you were just you felt like you were being inundated with all this different sort of information at the same time, like listening to music or being on your phone or all these different pieces of technology that you're more or less kind of interacting with all at the same time, and how that can sound a little overwhelming, and yet for some reason it's not. Maria, you were touching upon it, I feel, based upon more of like a dependability sort of thing, as like a means of intaking information and receiving news. And I agree with that. I'm grateful for technology in that aspect, because a lot of the things that I know about, news-wise and current event-wise are from electronic media. It sort of serves the same purpose as like a physical newspaper used to. Like every morning before I start work, I sit down, have breakfast, and I hop onto my Google feed to see articles of the news pertaining to my interests, pertaining to current events, news stories that are trending in the media, things like that. And it's sort of a similar ritual to, how you used to have, breakfast with the newspaper, sit down with a cup of coffee and the newspaper. It's sort of this similar purpose, just using a different medium. A lot of people like to say that the printed medium is going away because of the electronic medium, and I could say that personally I think that I would agree with that because of, things like that. I get my news purely electronically these days. That's just me, but I feel like that's kind of the norm these days, So that, I would say, responds to what you were saying, Maria, about technology and how you receive information and stuff. Rosa, you were talking about not so much, I think this is what you meant, like not so much the intake of information, like you're not necessarily paying attention to all of these devices and things that are happening all at once around you, despite the fact that they're all on, I guess you can say. And when you were talking about that, it reminded me of this genre of music that's been around since the early 1900s, particularly in France. It's considered a French genre of music, and it's called furniture music. And it's what furniture music is, or was. It was live music played by, typically they were stringed instruments, so you would have like something like a little tiny little orchestra of like 5 players or so. And they would play music to be in the background and to serve as a piece of furniture and to set an atmosphere. It was music that was considered to be taken out of context because you're not necessarily paying attention to them performing this music that would arguably be written to be performed in front of an audience or, you know, in a symphony orchestra in the proper setting. It's sort of the same idea as, like, you know, consider, this is a bit more morbid of an example, but like whenever you think of something in a museum, such as like a mummy from Egypt that is on display in a museum, that is an Egyptian piece of, I suppose you could call it artwork, that is taken out of its context and used for the sake of, you know, informing the public, things like that. That's another example of art being taken out of context and yet still being effective. So furniture music is similar in that it's taken out of context. You know, what the music that's being played is being taken out of context, but it's still serving a purpose. That purpose is for the sake of being in the background. And that reminded me of what you were saying, Rosa, because you were talking about having music on in the background, having like technology on in the background, whether it be like a TV or a radio or your computer or something like that. Just having something on in the background that you're not necessarily paying attention to or taking in, but at the same time it's still there and it's still a part of your senses and it's still just sort of a piece of the atmosphere in your room or what have you. So it was interesting in that, you know, this is sort of something that we as humans have done for a very long time when you consider things like furniture music, which is from the early 1900s again, you know? And I thought that that was kind of interesting how that behavior hasn't really changed in us. Furniture music is a really interesting topic. Contemporary furniture music, you could say, can be found in the form of, I know the musician Björk has this album called Vespertine, released a few years ago, that was heavily inspired by furniture music. So it's still something, it's still a concept that we not wrap our heads around, but engage with now. So it was interesting seeing how that behavior hasn't changed from then to now. You know, thinking about like media archaeology and how things were back then versus how things are now, you know, despite the fact that things advance, they're still more or less the same or still more or less serve the same purpose. You know, news has progressed from printed media to electronic media, and yet it still serves the same purpose. So I thought that that was kind of interesting. Let's see, Shannon, in your video, you were talking about, let's see, yes, you also thought the reading was very abstract, which I very much agreed with. And you brought up, not having to travel to like a library to access information anymore, and it's all like at your fingertips. You know, I would say that that's a convenience that many people of yesteryear would have loved to have. It's sort of a conundrum in that, you know, nowadays we long to preserve what was, you know, the library, what other things are considered outdated, the library. A lot of grocery stores have been hurt by, like, Google, for example, has a service where they deliver groceries to you. Google, I think it's called Google Express. Amazon has really, online shopping has really affected modern day shopping malls, things like that. I guess I'm thinking of more like commercial examples. But back in the day, those sorts of things were the norm. And even further back in the day, you know, you had whatever those iterations were. Like you had, I wouldn't know, like farmers markets and things like that. That might be a little bit of a generalization of an idea considering what they had in the past. But it's just, I see a common trend of things serving the same purpose, but taking on a new form. You know, we're always trying to find new ways to do what we've always done, but more efficiently, which is interesting because that can be a little exhausting because it brings about like nostalgia and a longing for the way that things used to be, while at the same time, like I said earlier, it's sort of a conundrum in that we're always trying to move forward, and we're always trying to find a new way to do things, and yet we're always trying to preserve what used to be. So it's an interesting little problem that media archaeology has brought for itself. Let's see, you also said that we're not a physical space, like in the reading, how we're all addresses according to the postal office, but now we're just sort of IP addresses for computers. You know, we always seem, users always are categorized based upon like a numbered criteria or a statistical criteria, sort of like how, you know, I think the unit before last we were talking about Mauing, MAU, how we as users are always sort of boiled down to statistics and numbers. And it's interesting how businesses, corporations, and us, the consumer or human beings, work with each other. You know, we use these corporations to serve our daily lives and to make them better and to make our lives more meaningful, while these corporations see us as means of profit and statistics and ways to drive their business. So it can feel a little dehumanizing and like you're just sort of serving a machine, you know? Let's see, technology's taken over the world, man. You also talked, I also was thinking about the circulation of info. Shannon, you sparked this thought process within me. Circulation of info brings about justice and injustice. Like you were talking about the hundreds of people that were arrested as part of the Occupy Wall Street, and how that might not have happened if photos of that incident were not circulated online. There are times in which social media and the internet can be used to bring about justice to people who deserve it. But there are also times in which it does go a bit too far. I think, Sarah, you brought this up in one of your video responses, in which like sometimes the addresses of people who have done something wrong will come up and be made public information. Those people will receive like death threats and things like that. And sometimes it can be taken a little bit too far. So it's always like a little bit of a delicate balance in seeking social justice, you know, through the means of the internet. Is it a necessary thing? I think that it's a revolutionary thing, in that we can collectively call justice upon somebody due to the injustices that they've performed. Brock Turner is an example that I think of. Brock Turner, who raped a woman behind a dumpster, and he received the absolute minimal jail time ever. It blows my mind, because he's rich and because his father's rich, and they can, you know, it makes me angry. But people recognize that because that injustice was spread throughout the internet and people called for justice. People will never forget what Brock Turner did, and he will live with what he did for the rest of his life. That would not have happened if social justice through the internet wasn't brought. Because again, he comes from a very rich family, and he comes from a very powerful family, and this might have been something that he would have gotten away with if the public hadn't collectively called for justice. If his story, if what he did wasn't spread on the internet. I think that that's a good example of what we can do as people through the power of social media and electronic media. helping victims of, you know, tragic circumstances, whether it be, you know, seeking justice for them, or like donating to a Kickstarter or donating to some kind of charity. That's all something that we can do from electronic media. I guess I'm straying from the topic now, although there isn't really a solid topic this week, you know what I mean? So anyway, yes, I would hope that technology continues to progress in a way that the common people can benefit from it, because it is the common people who, believe it or not, have the most power when they work collectively. And yeah, what happened to Brock Turner is a good example of that. So justice finds a way, not always, but we can help it find its way sometimes, so long as, you know, we're doing the right thing. All right, guys. Anyways, I'll talk to you later. Goodbye.